Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we've got another fascinating interview today. We're going to be talking with Jennifer Maynard, who's the CEO and co-founder of Nutrition for Longevity. They make a healthy and environmentally friendly meal plan. It's a subscription service for vegan and pescatarian eaters, and it looks delicious. And she's also been in the biotech and pharmaceutical industries for a couple of decades before launching a company, Nutrition for Longevity, offering these subscription meals. But she developed an expertise in regenerative farming, which is a very hot topic. Jennifer also contributed an article to Earth911 recently about the impact of industrial farming on our soils. It's called Zombie Soil, the harmful result of industrial farming. We'll share a link to that in the podcast introduction. But we have a lot to talk about. Welcome to the show, Jennifer. How are you?
Good. Thank you, Mitch, for having me. Very excited to talk about these topics.
Well, the first thing is we were really interested in the regenerative farming aspects of what you work on. And thanks very much for the story. A lot of people are talking about regenerative farming because of the film Kiss the Ground, which featured Woody Harrelson as the narrator. It has really started people talking about how we've exhausted our farmland with industrial practices. And your article makes a very clear distinction about the difference between soil and dirt. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest difference is, there's two things that I like to differentiate. One is the biodiversity under our feet. Mm-hmm. And dirt has very little biodiversity. And as we've found out with our human gut microbiome and most things, that diversity is really important. And what's incredible for me with the soil microbiome is, we started the Human Genome Project, and it got a lot of focus on the fact that more than half of the DNA in our bodies is not human. Well, the same thing is true in plants and in soil. And what they found out, they started the Earth Microbiome Project, was a spinoff of that. And what they found out is we know about 1 times 10 to the minus 22nd power. So that's 22 zeros after a point. So that's a lot. So what a lot of scientists will basically say is we know about nothing, or we know very little about what's under our feet. So that's about all the microbes that live in the soil we know very, very little about. But what we have found is that genetic diversity is essentially the immune system of a plant. Mm-hmm. So when we have really diverse soil, they work with the microbes in that soil to become more resilient to the stresses that they're under. Just like the gut microbiome we're now finding is where over 70% of the human immune system resides. That's the same with the soil microbiome for plants. So when we decimate that biodiversity and we turn our soil into dirt, we're actually severely impacting a plant's ability to survive. So that's one thing I like to differentiate. The other is the soil organic matter, which I look at like a sponge, and it does a lot of things. It holds in water. So we have really good water retention when we have really good soil organic matter. So in the US, we used to be on average at 11% soil organic matter. We're now down to less than 1%. So we are very close to dirt. And what that means is we're not retaining water. So for every 1% soil organic matter we increase in our land, we save about 170,000 gallons of water per acre per year. So our farm that we took over and regenerated started at about 1.7. It's now at about 6%. So we're about halfway there. And think about that. It's 40 acres of regenerative farmland at 170,000 gallons per year times 6, times 40. So you can multiply that really fast. And if you look at fresh water is also becoming a scarce resource. We have a lot of desertification happening. Our water scarcity issues are very much man-made, and we could use farming and regenerative farming to start to address some of those issues as well. So you have the water retention, it's like a sponge, mm-hmm. and then you have the carbon sequestration capabilities, and that's huge because we've lost 2/3 of our carbon stores from the ground into the atmosphere. So it's this huge sponge that we could start reversing that and bringing that atmospheric carbon back into the soil, which is what regenerative farming is all about. So there's this huge carbon sequestration capability. And if you look at books like Drawdown, if you add up all the different elements that they talk about in the book Drawdown, about 35 of them revolve around agriculture, showing that it's really the number one thing we should be focusing on. That's the lowest cost, most effective way that we could start reversing climate change. So that's all about the difference of soil and dirt, is the ability to have biodiversity, which improves the plant's health and the plant's immune system. And then on the reverse, the environmental impact from water and carbon sequestration.
So somebody walks out in their backyard and picks up a handful of what's on the ground, whether it is soil or dirt. How would you tell the difference?
So
I would describe soil as loamy generally, but what's the difference?
Well, soil can be all sorts of different things. You can have sand in soil and still have really healthy soil. It depends on the region and what happened. Like our farm in New Jersey is on glacial land. So it was under glaciers. So it's got a lot of minerals. It's actually very nutrient rich soil. So you have a lot of really good content to work with. But again, that soil organic matter is really what makes a difference. And when you hold it, even if you have different types of sandy soil, loamy soil, it can still be soil, but it has more structure to it. So soil has versus dirt. Dirt will just crumble in your hands. It literally will run through your fingers. Whereas soil, you can kind of squeeze it, right, and it creates almost like a form. It's not quite like clay. So usually it has a little bit of clay. Obviously,
it has
clay,
a structure but
it's got a structure. It's got a matrix to it. Yeah.
Now, you use the term heritage farming to describe the regenerative approach to the land. Can you kind of summarize what that entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So I like to give credit to I don't feel like regenerative farming is actually a new thing. I feel like it's just reviving. I like to call it a renaissance, because we're trying to bring back all of the really good parts of farming that we lost over what we call the green movement, or the green agricultural movement, which is ironic because that's when all the chemicals and tillage and stuff came in. We called it green.
Yeah, but revolution was not.
Yes, it was everything but green. But the reason why I like to say heritage, if you look at most indigenous regions, and actually if you look at the longevity diet and the regions that it was designed behind, areas where people live the longest, healthiest lives, they essentially use regenerative farming across the board. And so a lot of indigenous communities have been doing this for decades and decades. And I mean, some areas, thousands of years, and they've passed that down. Even aquaponics, which we do on our farm, is actually 4,000 years old. So, to take credit for that, I don't think is fair, but to say we're reviving something that was really already working really well. And if you look even in the United States, there was a lot of a good share of regenerative farming practices. We don't do as much of that on our farm. But it can involve rotating livestock or hooved animals. And if you look at a good share of probably half of the U.S., you had a lot of the bison or buffalo migration, and you had a lot of tribes that literally migrated with that. And they grew food behind these hooved animals, which through their manure and breaking down the soil, they actually regenerated it and created incredibly rich soil to grow crops in. And obviously, we've lost that. And if you look at the centenarian regions, it's all about working with the land and working with Mother Nature to keep the ground covered, to minimize tillage. You still need some movement in the soil, which is why hooved animals are so effective at it, is they do punch the ground a little bit, and they leave their manure behind, which has a lot of biodiversity in it. But you don't want to overdo it, and modern tillage severely overdoes it. And
we till every year, right? And that really seems to be one of the major differences. Is the low or no till approach leaves the soil intact in order to create that structure we were talking about.
Exactly. So the soil organisms, whether it's fungi, bacteria, nematodes, things like that, most of them don't like being disrupted. They like creating this matrix. It's like a neural network. And when you till, you disrupt that. So you disrupt their communication platform. You disrupt their food network. It would be like taking a city and just taking some dozers through it. And so it has that ecosystem, that mini ecosystem has to just start over again every time you till. So we do things like when we first break ground, we will build bed rows. And so we do disrupt the soil a little bit to do that, but we try to never really disrupt it after that. The first few years, we might broad fork, which is just to kind of stick a spike down. You get a little bit of aeration in there to make sure water can trickle and fully move into the ground and you don't have compaction. But after that, every year, it's really less and less disruption. You're just almost just layering compost and things like that on top. So, and those are some of the key regenerative farming practices. Ones that we use on our farm is we don't till after we cut a bed. We really try to never disrupt that again. We keep the ground covered year round. If you look at Mother Nature in pretty much all areas except desertification areas, Mother Nature keeps the ground covered. And that's because it's sensitive like our skin. You got to think of the flora on your skin that you're protecting from UV damage, and you're keeping it covered with clothing or sunscreen or like a hat. And that's the way the soil is. You really have to protect it from wind, rain, sunlight, things that could damage those microorganisms. So we keep the ground covered with living or decaying mulches pretty much all the time so that soil is protected and it's holding in moisture. We also do a lot of intercropping, which helps keep that ground covered, so you can actually get more yield out of the land, but you're actually supporting the land and keeping it covered and keeping roots in the ground. So we don't, other than if it's a root crop, obviously a carrot, I have to pull it out of the ground. Sure. But like tomatoes and stuff like that, we actually leave the root base in the ground because it just further builds up that matrix. So we leave as much in the ground as possible. We disrupt it as little as possible. And then we do a lot of perennial hedgerows as well, because those are roots that permanently stay in the ground. And above ground, they create native pollinator habitats. So we focus on native plants. Insect biomass is down 80% just in the last 30 years. And if you look at the food chain, that's frightening. And what's happening is invasive species are really starting to outnumber the native species in a lot of areas because they don't have habitats. And so
we've made it unfriendly for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do almost every 10 to 15 rows, we have a full pollinator hedgerow that helps build up those communities of healthy insects. So we don't have to spray and use pesticides and stuff like that on the farm, because the only real things that we use on the farm to combat against pests other than natural practices like the perennial hedgerows is we use a bit of diatomaceous earth, which are fossilized little tiny seashell fossils, which irritate soft-bodied insects. And then we'll use essential oil sprays. And that's pretty much our two things that are go-to on the farm to combat against really, challenging pests that are devastating a crop. But that's really different than most farms. Even organic, you're allowed to spray a lot. And we really, we think even organic, you got to be careful with what you spray, because it's a lot of these broad spectrum, even organic pesticides are still impacting your soil microbiome. And so we're really careful with anything we spray on the farm or sprinkle on the farm or bring onto the farm. So that's kind of to where we take regenerative farming.
Now, does this suggest that we have to return to more smaller farms, or could an industrial, big business farm use rotational cropping and no-till practices at their scale?
I think there's both. I do believe in the U.S. we would benefit immensely from smaller farms. Like for us, our strategy is 50 to 100 acre farms. We think that's the sweet spot where you can really aggressively regenerate soil. I know of some larger farms that are around the 3,000 to 6,000 acre, which is really large, that are doing grain farming. So the thing is, it depends on what farming you're doing. We do row crop farming. 40 acres, biointensive row crop farming is actually a pretty large size farm. When you're doing monocrop like grain farming, you actually do need more land. They get far less yield for grain than a vegetable crop. So you do need more land in general. And they can do managed grazing practices at a pretty large scale. In fact, you kind of need a larger scale if you're going to have large grazing animals. We only have a few goats and chickens and ducks on the farm because you can't really have large livestock on a 48. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. What we need to do is, that's my biggest challenge with beef production, is that we don't have enough spread out We do it in these really concentrated clusters, which is why it impacts the environment in such a negative way. If we did managed grazing, it would make that actually a positive impact. But you have to have very few cows per acre, and it's got to be tightly managed, and you got to have the proper rotations. But you can do it, and there's more and more farms starting to convert over. Like Rodale Institute has now a certification that they just launched. So just like organic certification, people will start to be able to see on labels if this is also using regenerative practices. And that's where these large scale grain farms, I think, can be really effective at doing that. And that's where some of this heritage farming comes back to life.
Now, let's turn to nutrition for longevity. Are you growing all of the food that is in the box on your farm?
We grow the majority of the fresh produce on our farm. So we don't grow grains. We specialize in vegetable production. Okay. So we do source our grains. We're very picky with what suppliers we work with. We always try to source them from a regenerative farm. Not all of our grains and things like that are available yet at scale. So we're really trying to work to get more farms converted over and find those farms and source from them. We always source organic, non-GMO, obviously. Mm-hmm. But we grow the majority of our produce. We do have, like right now, this time of year is what we call the winter drear. We have the least amount of produce coming from the farm. So we have indoor aquaponics facilities that we grow all of our microgreens, leafy greens, kales, Swiss chards, lettuce, pretty much all of our herbs. We grow those year round indoors, but things like peppers this time of year, we don't grow on the farm. They're even in our high tunnels, they're very difficult to grow year round. So there are some crops, we try to ramp them down. Our menu is very seasonal, so we try to just not run those in our recipes. So we don't have to bring stuff over from California or other long distances. So we really try to do as much local sourcing as possible. And we try to get as much of it from our own farm as possible. So we have a very high output on our farm. We even have overages that we have to find different outlets to donate that or make sauces. We try to use every single thing on the farm. We even use our carrot tops for pesto and things like that.
Now, you have a 2-star Michelin chef doing these meal curations and recipes. Tell us about what a meal consists of.
Yeah, so our meals follow the longevity regions of the world. So Dr. Longo researched those for 30 plus years. And what he found out is of the 5 regions we focus on, they have essentially the same macronutrient ratio. So they're almost entirely plant-based. They eat a little bit of fish. Some of them eat small portions of meat, but it's a very, very small portion of their lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And they're active. They move around a lot. They're not doing like intensive workouts, but the funny thing is most centenarians are actually shepherds or farmers. So they're active their entire life. They're moving around. It's not that they're going to a gym, but they're staying active. And they've even looked at things as simple as, some of the bakers or chefs that are cooking the food, they don't use as much electric blenders and things like that. They'll be stirring it with a spoon. And so what they notice is they have a lot of stairs. So they just have a lot of things, even as they age, that keep them moving. And then they eat this very plant-forward diet, and most of their proteins coming from legumes. And this is a really interesting thing in the U.S. because other than certain cultural groups, we don't consume a lot of legumes, but every single longevity region consumes about a half a cup of beans a day or legumes a day. So that's what we focus on is very low refined foods. So we really avoid preservatives, fillers, additives. We only sweeten a little bit with maple syrup, but we try to avoid all refined sugars. We try to use all whole grains. So everything is really as whole food based as possible, because again, that's how these areas eat. So they use regenerative farming practices to farm the crops, and then they curate them with very minimal processing. And that's what we try to do. Our dietitians work on making sure we hit these exact macronutrient profiles, which the biggest difference from the American diet, the standard American diet, is they're very low in sugar. They're very low in salt, and they're actually moderate levels of protein. So in the U.S., we consume about 50 grams too much protein per day, and we consume about 70 grams too much sugar per day. So if you look at Dr. Longo's research, those protein and sugar are the two things, if they're in too high of amounts, they accelerate your aging genes. And he's proven this at multiple levels in mice and in humans. So we know that it activates the aging genes. So the reason it's called the longevity diet is we really avoid those foods that are going to accelerate your aging. So we have the dietitians really making sure that the ingredients and the macros follow the longevity diet. And then we have Luigi Finio, who then curates that and refines it. So we get this great flavor and with all this fresh produce that we get from the farm. And the farm is only about 5 minutes from our warehouse where we pull all this together. So we can literally pick it and start processing it right away, which I think is a huge benefit. And we have very little waste because of that. So we're able to really reduce the food waste. We waste about 65% of our food in the US. And that is one area in the drawdown book that is a huge opportunity for us to reduce waste and less carbon, is by really minimizing how many handoffs there are with food in our overall food model. So we really focus on that as well.
Now, in addition to the health benefits, because this is a plant-centric diet, do you have a sense of how much less CO2 is emitted for a meal or on an average week for somebody who eats using the Nutrition for Longevity diet versus buying frozen pizza?
So it's a really good question. And we actually are trying to quantify that. It's a bit challenging because there's so many debates on, how much carbon is actually used to produce a steak and how much carbon is used to transport food around the world. We do have averages of what we believe our farm sequesters based on the percentages of organic matter that we've increased. We also have made assumptions based on how much food waste we've reduced. But it's challenging to put an exact number to it. So we would say we're probably about half right now, including including our add-ons, because we do our food is in trays. There's different things that we add. But if you compared us to, say, a takeout meal at the grocery store, a frozen meal, we're typically about half of that based on all of our carbon sequestration, the reduced waste, and the ways that we manage our practices. So the one thing we're working on really hard is to move all of our packaging to 100% plant-based. We're very close to that because we actually want to be one of the first negative footprint companies, meaning we actually sequester more carbon than we generate in the entire end-to-end process.
So tell us about your packaging. That's a critically important issue here, especially since you're shipping this stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of folks are concerned about subscribing to a meal because they think of all the waste that goes with the packaging. So you are almost plant-based 100%? Is there plastic?
Yeah. Yep. So we have most of our packaging, all of our packaging is recyclable. But we're trying to move everything 100% plant-based. So by the end of this year, we should be like 95% there. There's certain things like our coffee bags. It's really challenging to preserve high quality coffee beans without a moisture barrier. So I spent a lot of time in the packaging area researching and had teams in this space really working on all sorts of packaging designs. So there are some limitations with certain products, but we've been able to really start to streamline this. And we have a new package of our trays that we're trialing right now that we're really excited about, that will get us really close to that 95% mark. So it's a really important part of the entire food industry to do everything possible to get to sustainable packaging. The technology hasn't been there until now, but there's a lot of movement in that space, and I think it's going to be huge. And, if we can move more of our eating habits to more of a plant-based, 80% of our farmland is used to produce grain, mainly for cattle. If we could start using some of that to produce plants that then are used also for some of these plant-based plastics, we could also start to neutralize a lot of those effects as well. So that's a big passion for me, and it's a huge priority for the company to be part of that movement and support that movement and really hit it from every angle we possibly can.
Now, when you get started with the diet, you have it's not complex, but there's a lot of selections that one can make in order to shape the right set of meals that they're going to receive. And you include, choosing vegan and pescatarian, the number of calories per day that you would like, which I assume 1,600 and 2,000 is for women and men, respectively.
Yeah.
How much does it cost on average to eat this way?
So our average without discount is about $12. So some people are like, whew, that's a lot of money. That includes dietitian consultations as well. So if people don't know what calorie range would be best for them, or they have questions about the food, our dietitians can walk them through and they get a consult. But, they published a report this year that the average American is spending $12.50 on a fast food meal. So we don't usually look at our food in that way. We don't look at, the coffee that we're buying at the cafe on the corner and the muffin we grab while we're over there. We don't look at the fast food bill usually because we have this mental thing that fast food is cheap. Well, it's grown faster than the food industry in the last 10 years, about 275%. The food industry has been at about 4% growth. So fast food's getting a lot more expensive than it used to be. So for us, we feel that for a regeneratively grown, organically grown meal that is really carefully tailored for optimal nutrition, that's really where we focus. And there are programs we're working on areas with food insecurity that we can get this food to those areas at either no cost or a very low cost, so we can offset that and make it available to everyone. But yeah, it's on average $12 a meal, and there's different configurations that people can select. And then we have even just produce boxes if people want to do their own cooking. So that brings the cost down a bit. And we're continuing to do things. We're expanding into some additional farms regionally. So we'll be in Texas this year and in California. So we really then are able to build these region for region models that also start to bring the cost down. Right, and also reduce the impact because you're shipping. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And for us, there's also a lot that goes into that. We pay our farm labor good wages. So I actually think farmers are probably the most underpaid of any profession. It's also the highest suicide rate profession in the U.S., which most people don't realize. But I, for example, could pay my farm employees almost half of minimum wage, which I think is completely unfair. I don't have to pay overtime and I don't have to pay benefits, but we choose not to do that. So we pay fair wages, we pay benefits, and we pay overtime because these are some of the hardest working people in the world. So there's a lot that goes into that. We are a company that focuses on sustainability. I can tell you our plant-based packaging costs a lot more than plastic, but it is a priority for us. So we do make those investments. Now, one last question, and this is related to everything we've talked about. Is there a book that you would suggest our readers take the time to go through to understand both regenerative farming and a longevity diet? So I think the first one is the longevity diet. So okay. It is a book. Fair. And we can give your readers or your listeners access to that. We do for people that purchase the meal kit, they can also get it for free. They can call our customer service and we can get them the book. It's why I worked with Dr. Longo to create this company, because I wholeheartedly believe that we need to have this renaissance with the way we grow our food and have this renaissance with the way we feed and fast. So the longevity diet book talks about what foods we should eat when we eat to regenerate our body and when we shouldn't eat. So when we should actually fast, because the longevity regions also have extensive fasting regimens. They do prolonged fasting and they do intermittent fasting. So his book talks all about that, and not only what to eat, but when to eat to be optimal to regenerate the body at a cellular level. And it's just incredible. He has in there the whole story behind it, and also the clinical studies that show this is real, and the effects that protein and sugar are having on our bodies, and just basically debunks a lot of myths about food in our country, which are
it's really interesting because we were talking about heritage farming earlier, but heritage in the form of religious practices, the fasting and
Absolutely.
so forth, it was actually tuning our bodies, but we have discounted that as well.
Absolutely. And that's what he brings to light in the longevity diet book is every major civilization for a really long time had fasting regimens, whether it was in their religion or just different holidays and practices. And it was for health reasons, but we just, like you said, we just lost that partly because of the inconvenience of it. And Dr. Longo designed a fasting mimicking diet that actually allows you to still fast, and you can work and not really work out hard, but you can still work and function without all the side effects, because he believes that fasting is so critical and we need to bring it back into our routine. I do a long-term fast every 3 months. I'm a very healthy person, but I think it's a key part of that. And then I do circadian rhythm feeding every day. So I eat a 12-12, essentially intermittent fast. And that's how I have done things for the last several years. And it's been very life-changing for me. So there's things that people can change, even if they don't buy the food. There's things that they can change that are free. They don't have to invest a huge amount of money. And even I would say changing an intermittent fasting routine is probably one of the easiest things that you can do. Like a 12-12 fast just means you stop eating 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed, to let your body really wind down, let your melatonin start to build up, your cortisol start to come down. So you get good sleep, and it's clinically proven that it does help with sleep patterns, and it gets your body in a rhythm. And then when you wake up, you start to eat again. So it's a very natural cycle for your body. And then if you want deeper results, you can stretch that a bit more. But we really encourage people to at least do a 12-12 intermittent fast, so they can get their bodies on a natural cycle. So he talks about all that in the book. And then the other book that I do recommend for people, because it has very practical things that just your average person can do to contribute to climate change, is the book Drawdown. And it's not everything.
It's a great book that summarizes so many useful ideas.
Absolutely. And so those are the two that I kind of have on my library shelf, and I reference all the time. I've probably read the longevity diet book 10 times, just because every time I read it, I just absorb it in a different way. And then Drawdown is just incredible because there's so many things the average person can actually contribute to, that I think is really relevant and important. And if we don't all start doing our part, it's, we eventually, it will be too late. I am an optimistic person, and having worked in regenerative farming and seen how incredible Mother Nature can heal and revive the soil and plant life, there's incredible regenerative capacity. We have this huge carbon store right below our feet. There's so much we could start to do. We just have to start doing it, and that's what's key.
Well, and that is absolutely a great point to stop on, because it is all about each of us making a decision to take action. Jennifer, I want to thank you for taking time with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Well, we look forward to having you back, because we have lots of subjects we can talk about. Folks, that's Jennifer Maynard. She is the CEO and co-founder of Nutrition for Longevity, which you can find at nutritionforlongevity.com. That's all one word, all lowercase, nutritionforlongevity.com. Check out the diet, the subscription program, and learn a little about regenerative farming. Also, do read the article that Jennifer shared with us, Zombie Soil, the harmful result of industrial farming. There's a link in the article with this podcast. We're going to be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. I'll be thinking about you. Take care of yourselves, take care of one another, and let's all take care of the planet. Have a great day, folks.